Okay, gang, another video. This is, I think, my fourth that I've recorded today, and I think I might still be doing one more for our reading on the symbol, chapter 4 from Halsby. So I think I'm going to be doing that one after this one. So I just recorded the video on rhetoric as argumentation from Halsby, from the Untext book. And the other reading that we're looking at in this first week is one that I taught back in the day, taught it many times, back when I used to teach more like argumentation, debate type stuff. And this is by Wayne Brockriede, Arguers as Lovers. And Brockriede was a major theorist of, he was a rhetoric theorist, but more specifically like argumentation. But like Toulmin, you know, when you think argumentation, you can kind of go in the direction of like hard formal logic, or you can go in the direction of like rhetorical argumentation, right? And so what he says in the very first paragraph here, he's interested in the arguer him or herself. This is a little dated language-wise, but the person doing the arguing, and the person being argued kind of at. And he says at the end of that first paragraph, he says, I maintain that the nature of the people who argue in all their humanness is itself an inherent variable in understanding, evaluating, and predicting the processes and outcomes of an argument, right? So it's not just about logos. It's not just about reasoning, facts. Oh, I have the facts, therefore I shall win the argument, right? On, I think, a kind of basic common sense level, we know that that's garbage. But, you know, there's a lot of literature devoted to the ideas that, like, it should just be the reasoning. This was the modern period that I talked about last time, that kind of 15th through 19th, early 20th century stretch where logic, reason, science, very rigid kind of forms of reasoning were dominant, and rhetoric was kind of off to the side. There was a big resurgence of rhetoric in the 20th century. Perelman, Toulmin, in terms of argument, they're the ones who are doing really important stuff. And then the next wave would be people like Brockriede. And they were taking a very rhetorical approach to argumentation. So getting away from the rigid formulas, the abstract diagrams, all of these goofy terms about propositions and entailment and oh my goodness! We kind of lost touch, but I used to have a buddy, Dr. Woodbridge, James Woodbridge, in philosophy, and he does like really high-level, abstract, formal, rigid logic stuff that I don't understand at all. It looks like engineering schematics when I try to read these papers. So that is very unrhetorical. Rhetoric is interested in people, situations, real, life and blood and flesh kind of stuff, right? Like practical, on-the-ground reality stuff. And so what's really interesting about this essay is, gosh, when did this come out? I should have a date attached to this, because I want to say that it's like, I want to say it's like 80s, maybe even further back than that, right? This was a pretty major rejection of this long tradition of thinking about arguments as like formal things. Now we're moving away from that to think about argumentation as more of a human process that involves all kinds of messiness. You know, it was around this time that this new field of economics was kind of born. Economics going back to, you know, the early modern guys, the Adam Smiths and all the rest. It was meant to be this kind of study of like rational human beings doing rational things, right? You probably heard about like the government should behave like families, because families always make rational decisions about their budgets and da-da-da. You just always assume the rational user or subject or whatever. But then all of a sudden the behavioral economists were this kind of splint-off group basically acknowledging that like we rarely make rational decisions. When you think about addiction, when you think about like all kinds of, you know, we're easily swayed in all kinds of different directions, and we do things all the time that are irrational, right? And so it makes good sense to understand humans and humanness in all of its irrationality. That's more of the kind of the rhetoric concern is like, okay, this isn't right, logically speaking, or even a good way of reasoning or thinking, but it's working and people are responding to it, so we better understand it, right? The formal logic crew, like my buddy in philosophy, would be like, man, like that's all a bunch of bullshit. These people don't know what they're talking about or thinking about. And it's like, okay, great. It's nice to know that we have like a high level position in terms of what we should be aspiring to. But in terms of on the ground stuff, that's what the rhetoric folks are interested in. So Brockriede is saying, in this move away from those hard logicians, he's saying, look, we need to think about the kind of the character and the quality of the arguer and the attitude of the arguer toward their interlocutor. And so that brings us to this framing device. It's a sectional one. He talks about 3 stances that, you can think about in terms of argumentation, focusing on the arguer, the person who's trying to win over the day or advance a position or whatever, right? Or just thinking about the ways that you can engage with others and the kind of stances or positions or dispositions that you can take. And so the 3 stances that he talks about is you can be the rapist, you can be the seducer, or you can be the lover, right? And it's not terribly difficult stuff. I'll move through it pretty quickly, and it makes I think a lot of sense in terms of like how we spot the patterns of relations in terms of trying to influence and win over. Okay, so he says in that second paragraph on the first page, right in the middle, he says, the co-arguer's response may be influenced by who he is, who the arguer is, and what their relationship is. And I think this is really important. In that first chapter that we looked at just in that previous video, I was talking about that, the kind of the cultural context, right? And rituals and learning. That cultural context stuff and this business of context, and I talked about positionality. It has so much to say, right? Think about, today's kind of public political culture. It's so much about we go with who we trust or we go with who we like. And it doesn't kind of matter so much what they're saying. We know who we like and who we trust. And we're so very willing to be open and responsive over here, but very much not over there kind of thing, right? There's like hard lines are being drawn in terms of left and right, city, country, right? Like, and it kind of doesn't matter at a certain point, like how much good reasons you have. You just kind of can't cross those barriers. But inside of them, there's more of those like cozy relationships and more openness. And that's all quite fascinating, rhetorically speaking. But the point is that the relational quality or the lack thereof has so much to do with the success or lack of success of arguments. And, last video I mentioned about getting the audience on your side, right? It's so much easier to persuade, to sell, if you first establish a strong connection. I'm not trying to give away, secrets here, but in sales, you don't want to come out with the hard sell. You want to cozy up, right? You want to gain trust. When you gain trust, boy, the door's open, right? All right, so second page is when he gets into the 3 stances and starts talking through them here. So he says, my focus is on the arguer, but it's also really about that kind of the relationship between the arguer and the arguee, right? 3 stances. The first one characterized by the word rape. He says there's a lot of really interesting characteristics of these different stances that he works through, right? So a few lines down, he says they function through power, through an ability to apply psychic and physical sanctions, right? I have ability to kind of make your life miserable mentally or physically, through rewards and punishments, through commands and threats, right? So you have a kind of position of power and you can exploit that. That's a form of rape, right? So we're talking about coercion. The attitude, right at the bottom left there on page 2, he says, the attitude toward other people's arguers have an intent to rape, and the argumentative act itself can constitute rape. The argumentative rapist views the relationship as a unilateral one. I don't know if you'll end up taking the 409, the advanced version of this class with me, but if you do, we'll be working, the first thing that we work through is these kind of 4 main models of rhetoric. We're not going to get into this class, but I talk about the kind of 4 major traditions of rhetorical transactions and sort of characterizing them quite differently. And two of those models, the Gorgianic model and which is sophistic, or the Platonic model, are both unilateral. Unilateral meaning they're moving in one direction. Power and influence are moving from speaker onto audience, right? So the audience then becomes objects, as he said here. And the rapist thinks of the audience as object. You're just something that I'm moving through. I need you to do something. You're something that's functional for me, or you're in the way of me getting somewhere. But you are not human. You don't exist. I just need to sort of plow through you. So objects are as inferior human beings. It talks about manipulation, violation of the victims. Next paragraph on 3 there in the kind of right middle section, he talks about power structures, which I think is quite interesting. You think about positions of authority. You think about, well, we've had a lot of this kind of awakening in the last few years in terms of, the difficulties of saying no or resisting, when you are dealing with these imbalances of power and authority and positionality and so on, right? So it's interesting to think of these as inherently kind of raping kind of relationships when one person has like really no ability to resist or to change the dynamic. So second to last paragraph in the middle, he says, when one adversary sees another as an object or as an inferior being, and when he intends to destroy the opponent. Such a relationship. So where do we find this kind of thing? He says it exists in courtrooms, in political campaigns, small group deliberations. He talks about business meetings, legislative chambers, and he also, clearly someone who's done this, he talks about intercollegiate debate. I don't know if any of you had any familiarity with intercollegiate debate. Many years ago, I was driving around with a buddy who, at the time, was a debate coach. He ran a team. This was elsewhere, right? And I won't mention the name, but it was quite interesting. We were driving around doing something. Meanwhile, his team and his assistant coaches were off at a tournament, and he was being texted by one of his coaches, graduate student. It's like, we're about to go up against whoever, and my buddy, the debate coach or director of debate, responded something like, tell the guys to mother effing kill them, this other team, right? And I just remember thinking, like, in debate? Like, is that what we're doing in debate? Like, I had no idea. I was so clueless. I thought debate was about, like, discovering, dialectics, ancient philosophical kind of stuff, where we sit around this kind of Socratic thing where we explore ideas and we open things up. No. This is about, like, destroying the other team with evidence and all these intricate maneuvers and everything. And I just was like, go murder those mother effers? Like, that's what the director says to the grad student coach to tell the undergraduates at this tournament. So yeah, that checks out, I think. I just like intercollegiate debate. Sounds a lot like intercollegiate football. All right, so the other ingredient concerns the role of the victim, right? So the arguee, the person who's the object. And the point here is, like, it doesn't kind of really matter so much if the rapee is trying to resist or doesn't really care or isn't even aware or pushes back or whatever. The point is like the power is the dominant kind of thing here. So it's really about that kind of unilateral moving toward and through and overcoming and seeing the other as dirt object, in the way or whatever, right? All right, so that's the stance, and we can probably think of lots of examples in terms of politics, in terms of, the culture that we now are in is very much about, like, there's a lot of that kind of energy. Now, the next stance that we can check out after the rapist would be the seducer. And this one seems a lot sort of softer and milder, but I would argue that it's just as insidious, this idea of seduction. In fact, I think a lot of my own research is really about kind of rooting out the seducer, because what to me seems insidious about the seducer is, and I wrote on this column here, is it's cold disguised as warm, right? Because he's talking on page 5 at the top there about the attitude of indifference. And indifference is like, I don't care, you're kind of an object to me, but I'm not going to go out of my way to, like, dominate you. I'm indifferent. So that's a coldness, But the seduction part is when you still try to warm your way in and snuggle up and move around. It's very snaky and serpentine, I think. So advertising, seduction is in the middle of page 4 there, operates through charm or deceit. Charm, the seductiveness of charm. The reason I think I can't stand it so much is because it's so invisible and it's hard to kind of spot. It's camouflage. A lot of my work is about kind of spotting camouflaged efforts to disguise, influence, where it's definitely happening. In fact, I'm just finishing up an article about digital influence. And this is kind of the crux of the argument, is like so much of what's happening is disguised itself as like, oh, not happening at all, or whatever. It's like, you don't see it, it's fine, don't look over here. But again, we're dealing with a unilateral relationship, right? And so the seducer is working on the seducee as an object, but it's a lot more subtle, it's a lot more discreet, but just as insidious, I think. So the conscious use of stratagems that appear in lists of fallacies. All right, so there's lots of like clever, artful uses of language and appeals, and again, thinking about relationships. It's about that. Remember what I said about getting on your side or get the audience on your side. Well, you can easily seduce, and so we're in that realm of like deception and is it or isn't it, and to me that's fascinating and troubling. So he says we see this especially in politics and advertising, right? And that's what I've been writing about, is sort of the digital marketing and advertising and how it's kind of changed persuasion completely. Now, the attitude of the would-be seducer is indifference to the humanness of the other person. Yep, to win by beguilement. That's a good word, beguilement. You're beguiled is sort of like you're like swooning. You barely can even like tell what's happening, right? So you're just like you're in a trance. All right, so that's the second stance, and I'm going to wrap up here. So the third stance is the lover. The lover is the stance of love. And this is not unilateral, this is bilateral, right? And so, again, when I do my 4 main models, this is, well, I don't have a lover specifically, but there's 2 models that are bilateral. One is Aristotle and one is Isocrates/Cicero. But they don't quite line up perfectly here. Nevertheless, this idea of seeing the audience or the interlocutor as a fully, co-present member of this exchange, and you kind of need them, you want them, You're chasing something that's kind of bigger than both of you, and you need the other to get their idea, right? And so in that sense, you cherish them. You want the best out of them. Says here, bilateral relationships, looks at the other person as a person, wants power parity. Lover argues with his peer and is willing to risk his very self in an attempt to establish a bilateral relationship, right? This risking of self is crucial. Again, but you're in the service of something bigger, some larger pursuit or truth. When I was reading through this, I was reminded of, I don't know if anyone else out there watches Top Chef. I have been watching Top Chef since the very first season, going back 20 seasons now. I'm a big food guy. I love to cook. I love everything about it. I write about food. I'm obsessed. And so I watch Top Chef religiously because it's the best cooking competition show. And what I've noticed over the years is the first season, back when reality TV was kind of in its, early infant stage or whatever, it was all about those kind of like raw competitions where everyone's trying to screw each other over, very much in that kind of rapist mode of like, I'm going to get you before you get me, and I'm going to shame you, and there's lots of fighting and screaming, and they kept throwing alcohol into the mix to kind of make things worse. And that was reality TV back then. But it's evolved over the years in a really fascinating way. And so now the last few seasons of Top Chef, it's so lovely to see these chefs come onto the game, and there's a whole different vibe, a whole different attitude. And the attitude now is we want to support each other to each be the best that we can be. We want to compete. We want to know who's the best, but we want to know that everyone is working at their best game, and then it's really just a kind of like good job kind of thing. It's just so much of a different attitude and a different kind of culture, and so much more enjoyable, right? Because it's like no one is trying to bring anyone down. Everyone's trying to lift each other up. And that feels like exactly what he's talking about here in terms of lovers. We're trying to chase this pursuit, and it's a love of cuisine, and it's like doing it at your best level, and I want to see what you've got, and I want to bring what I've got, and like let's help each other get there and support each other, even though we are also contestants. It's so exciting to see that, because you can, I don't know, I feel like you get the best food, you get the best results in a kind of atmosphere of mutual support, versus the early days where it's literally just like, how can I destroy each other? How can everyone destroy each other and like screw each other over? So it's really about attitude, and it's about kind of how you pursue your goals and what those goals are. Now, interestingly, and I'll wrap up here in a sec, he says at the end, he talks about 4 kind of final concluding observations, and there's like 2 that are, I think, important. The first one is like, seems obvious, like neither one of these positions is all or nothing kind of thing, right? There can be mixtures and so on. The second one, though, is the most interesting to me. Now, I think it's toward the end of our time together. Might even be, week 4. We're going to read something called Beyond Persuasion by Foss and Griffin. And I'd like for you to keep this second observation in mind, because what he says here, I think, is really insightful and also frustrating. He says, basically, people engaged in the process of decision-making and persuasion must either rape or seduce. Right? So you think about like COVID, like when we were all going in this lockdown, and like everything was very tense, and there was risk, and there was danger and uncertainty, and even a little panic, and decisions need to be made, and action needs to be taken. And his point is like, in those kinds of situations, you can't love in the way that philosophers and grad students and professors in seminars and scientists, the way that they kind of love this pursuit together, or chefs on a show or whatever. When time is of the essence, and when there's much at stake, and all the rest of it, the suggestion here is that you can't be a lover in those kinds of situations. You must either rape or seduce. That's a little bit of a bummer idea, and I want us to kind of just hang on to it. Is it true? Is that in fact the case? And then when we get into the Beyond Persuasion article later on, they're going to basically sort of make the case that, we should be lovers. They don't use the language of lovers, but it's a similar kind of approach. We should be lovers like always. And my question in response to that is like, who doesn't love the lover approach, right? But like, can we think of that in operating in all instances? And what about instances where, decisive action needs to be taken? And what do we sacrifice, and what are the trade-offs, and all the rest of it? So there's some tricky questions there. Nevertheless, I think it's a really evocative, short little piece that gets us thinking about the ways that we engage one another, and maybe what we might expect out of them. We're not looking at sort of the details of the ideas and how they're coming across, that Toolman kind of stuff. It's more about ethos, persona. It's more about your personhood and how you relate to others and how you treat them, right? And how all those things are framed, I think, has much to say about the outcomes of any given specific kind of claim, data, warrant thing that you might be talking about, right? So it all matters. All right, that's plenty. I will stop her there, and I think I'm going to do one more on symbols, and that's it. So hope all's well still. See ya.